second talk of today is me, because Rosenblatt is about invalidities.
Well, thank you to the organizers for putting this together. Very happy to be here. All right, so I'm going to talk about a weird topic, I guess, which is invalidities, which is something most talks about. All right, so I guess that the main claim that I want to make is that we should pay more attention to them, to invalidities, and that at least we should, at least in certain contexts, it might be important to take both validities and invalidities. So it's primitive to give a treatment of both of them. But okay, so let me just make some introductory remarks first. So I think that typically validity is taken to be this perfectly non-ambiguous expression. So we all know what we mean when we say that a certain argument is valid. But actually, that's not really the case. So there are many ways of understanding what it is for an argument to be valid. So here's what I think is the most typical way of understanding validity. We equate validity with necessary preservation of truth in virtual logical form. Some people are not satisfied with this, and they say, no, validity is actually necessary preservation of truth. Form is something that we should give up. Other people say, validity is preservation of truth over a certain class of models. For example, if you're a stubborn model theorist, you would say something like this, I guess. Other people will say that validity is preservation of warranted searchability. Some other people will even say that it's preservation of certain attributes, not just of warranted searchability. Other people, still, this goes on and on, will say that validity should be understood as preservation of truth over all substitution. So there's this thing that many people are now advocating, which is the substitutional account of consequence. Other people will say that validity can be understood as derivability in a certain formal system, and on it goes. So I really could go on. So it's really debatable. It's really something that's not settled whether we should understand validity in the usual, typical way. So here I'm going to focus on a particular conception of validity, which I'll call the Russell-Ripley conception, which is something that Dave and Greg have been endorsing for a while. So very roughly, the idea here is that a certain statement gamma implies a statement delta, if and only if accepting gamma is incoherent with rejecting delta. So the idea here is to explain validity in terms of this more primitive notion of incoherence. I should say that Greg and Dave sometimes use other terms such as bounds and stuff like that, or they say that assertions clash with denials. But I'm going to use incoherence because I'm more familiar with that. But there's no substantial issue there, I guess. All right, so I've simplified the accounts, and in this case, I'm only considering arguments with a single premise and a single conclusion, but later on I'll generalize. All right. So here, the primitive notion is incoherence, and although it is a primitive notion, that doesn't mean that it's left completely unexplained. I mean, we can make some remarks about what we mean when we say that a certain set of attitudes or speech acts are incoherent. So I'm assuming that we have some kind of pre-theoretical grasp of what it means to say that a set of speech acts or a set of attitudes is incoherent, even if that grasp is sort of rough and incorrect. All right. So I should also say that this account of consequence is based on an inferentialist account of meaning. So I take it that you're all familiar with this idea, but the point is that the meaning of certain expressions is determined by the rules that govern their use. And in particular, it's based on a specific inferentialist view, which goes by the name of bilateralism, which again you're all familiar with. So here it's not only the assertoric uses that are important to specify the meaning of a certain expression, but we also have to take care of the denials. We also have to pay attention to the denials. And in particular, there has been, as far as I know, two ways of spelling out the bilateralist idea. In some early papers by Smiley and Price, and also later Rumfit, the idea is to use force indicators and to offer things like systems of natural deduction, where sentences are labeled with these force indicators that stand for assertion or denial. And more recently, Luca and Julian have further extended this approach with other kinds of speech checks, like weak assertion, weak denial. But there's this other approach, which is also bilateral, and which doesn't use these force markers, but instead, at least from a formal point of view, uses multiple conclusion sequence calculi. And so in the talk, I'll mostly focus on this latter variety. Okay, so here is the idea now generalized into arguments which have many premises and possibly many conclusions. So to say, or the claim that a certain argument from a collection of statements gamma to a collection of statements delta is valid is basically to say that accepting all the statements in gamma is incoherent with rejecting all the statements in delta. By the way, I'm more or less using acceptance as synonymous with, acceptance of is a certain attitude that one has towards propositions, and assertion is a speech act that one makes, but I'm more or less using them equivalently. I think nothing of what I say hangs on this. Okay, so here the validity of the corresponding inference expresses some kind of norm that establishes a prohibition to accept the premises of the argument while rejecting the conclusions. Okay, so it's important to see that here this incoherence should be understood as a prohibition, because later on I'll equate invalidity with a dual kind of permission. Okay. So as I said, this account is typically formally spelled out by means of multiple conclusion sequence calculi, and the reading of validity in terms of incoherence has led Greg, for instance, to say that the familiar structural rules are justified. So, for instance, given that it's plausible to think that accepting a certain sentence phi is incoherent with rejecting it, then the corresponding consequence relation will be reflexive. Or in other words, the structural rule of identity will be justified. By the way, I'm borrowing this little symbol from Dave's book, I think. So I'll use that symbol to stand for the sort of notion of validity that I'm talking about, which, bear in mind, is not the usual notion of validity, but it's this notion that it should be understood in terms of coherence and incoherence. Okay, additionally, if we also have weakening, or that the resulting consequence relation is monotonic, because if accepting a bunch of statements is incoherent with rejecting a bunch of other statements, then if we go on to accept or reject more things, then it will still be incoherent. That is, we cannot suddenly become coherent by accepting or rejecting more things. There's this other structural rule, you've probably heard of it, which is transitivity. And here, I think that Greg and Dave part ways. And so, whether the transitivity of this notion of validity can be justified is contentious. So, Greg argues that it can, Dave disagrees. I think that basically this agreement comes to this. Because of the way in which we are understanding and invalidity, transitivity can be more or less roughly identified with the claim that if a sentence is unassertable, then it cannot be undeniable. That's one way of spelling it out. If you reject transitivity, it is because you think that there are such statements that are unassertable and undeniable. By the way, all the Dave thinks is that under this way of understanding consequence, you don't immediately get a justification for transitivity. It's not that you immediately have counter-examples. Okay, but anyway, so I'll here assume, because I think that it is plausible to think that there are statements that are unassertable and undeniable, I'll side with Dave and assume that under this conception of consequence, transitivity might fail, or we don't obviously have a justification for transitivity. And this is going to be important later on. Okay, so, and at least on Dave's version of things, under this way of understanding validity, this is a material relation rather than a formal one. So here's a passage from Dave. Note that there's nothing interestingly logical about the notion of balance in play here. The notion we can find playing a role in our conversational practices is a material one. So again, bear in mind that the notion is not the typical thing. It's not, an argument can't be valid in a non-formal way. There might be cases where the validity of an argument is grounded on things other than the meaning of the logical connectives. And this is because it is our conversational practices that determine whether a certain set of attitudes is incoherent or not. Okay? Now, there's an interesting question here, which is how material is this relation supposed to be? And I'm not exactly sure. Here, I think that the controversial bit is whether we can have certain sets of attitudes being incoherent because of the way the world is, or just because of the meaning of the words involved in those sets of speech answer attitudes. So I take it that, under this conception of consequence, we do have incoherences we do have certain sets of attitudes that are incoherent, not in virtue of the meaning of the logical consequence, but in virtue of the meaning of other items. But whether we have the incoherence of certain sets of attitudes in virtue of certain worldly matters is not entirely clear to me. I think that this is the case, and that in some cases, if we understand consequence in this way, we will be, or at least it will be plausible to say that certain sets of attitudes will be incoherent in virtue of how the world is. But okay, that's contentious, so I'm going to leave it at that. Alright, so as I said, the main claim of the talk will be that under this understanding of the notion of validity, all the usual reasons to privilege the treatment of validities over one of invalidities lose much of their force. So let's see what those reasons are. Okay, so why do we take validities to be more fundamental than invalidities? Well, at first this seems like a silly question, yes. But once we seriously consider it, there are a bunch of reasons that are usually left tacit that support our taking validities to be more fundamental than invalidities, and so are focused on validities. So the first, I would say, obvious reason is that we are typically interested in what is true, and valid arguments are taken to preserve truth. However, invalid arguments do not preserve anything. Okay? Secondly, the set of classical first-order logical validities is axiomatizable. We can have a complete proof procedure. It's However, because classical first-order logic is non-decidable, we don't have a complete axiomatization of the set of invalidities of first-order classical logic. Third, validity has interesting formal properties. In particular, validity is usually taken to be this very formally interesting relation, which is reflexive, which is monotonic, which is transitive, and it also has this nice property, which is that it supports uniform substitution. Invalidity is not reflexive, it's not monotonic, and it's not transitive. It also doesn't support uniform substitution, so it seems like invalidity is not interesting in the way that validity is. And fourth, this is a bit more controversial. I gather that most philosophers would agree that valid arguments are normative for reasoning in some way, even if it is hard to specify in which precise way they're normative for reasoning. I mean, I don't know, but I think most people would agree that they are. But now, are invalid arguments normative for reasoning in any way? They don't seem to be. But okay. So these are the four reasons that I will consider. If you can think of some other reason that might lead us to focus on validities rather than on invalidities, please tell me. These are the four reasons I can think of, but I don't mean this list to be exhaustive. Okay, so let's start with truth preservation. As I said, we're interested in what is true, and valid arguments are typically taken to preserve truth, while invalid arguments don't seem to preserve anything. Now, again, because of the way in which we are understanding validity, that is in terms of incoherence, the notion of validity in question, the notion of consequence in question will be transitive only if for every statement phi it is either coherent to accept phi or it is coherent to reject phi. If you think that this is not the case, then the notion won't be transitive. And so if the notion is not transitive, then there is a sense in which truth preservation is gone. Here, I mean, there might be some possibility of misunderstanding. So, what do I mean by truth preservation here? I mean, in a non-transitive account, we can have something like this. We can actually endorse the claim that if an argument is valid, then if the premise is true, then the conclusion is true. That's something that we can have. It's possible to endorse that coherently in a non-transitive account. But what I mean here is simply the thought that if one starts from a true statement and then validly passes through several inferential steps to another statement, then there's no guarantee that the resulting statement will be true. So in that sense, at least, truth preservation is gone. Okay. So in this respect, I guess, so let me phrase it like this. One of the reasons to focus on validities rather than invalidities is kind of lost under this way of understanding validity. So validity and invalidity are on par in this regard. Okay, so let's move on to the issue of axiomatizability. So as I said, the set of classical first-order logical validities is axiomatizable, whereas its set of invalidities is not. Now, of course, this is just a consequence of focusing on classical first-order logical validities. But, as I pointed out before, the notion of validity that we are discussing now is a material relation. And so it is much, much broader than logical validity. And so, kind of borrowing this argument from Dave, it's kind of unrealistic to expect a theory of this notion to be complete. At best, we can hope for a partial but sound axiomatization or theory of this notion. But completeness is sort of ruled out, or it's not an option here. So again, in this respect, the notions of validity and invalidity are apart. We shouldn't expect completeness for one or for the other. There are a bunch of worries that could be raised here, for instance, that the sort of incompleteness in question is different in one case and in the other. So in the case this approach to validity is that it doesn't really matter if we're discussing logic. I mean, we wanted validity to be this broader notion, so the distinction between the logical and the non-logical doesn't play a very important role. But okay, if you want to discuss that, I'm happy to address it in the Q&As. Okay, so moving on to the third reason, which was about the formal properties that validity has and invalidity doesn't. So as I said, invalidity is not reflexive, nor monotonic, nor transitive, and it does not support uniform substitution. Now, the first thing to note here is that the notion of validity that we're dealing with, if what I said is correct, is non-transitive. So one of these formal properties is already gone. Still, the notion is both reflexive and monotonic. But note that the notion of invalidity is irreflexive in the sense that no sentence fails to imply itself, and it's anti-monotonic in the sense that if you take some invalid argument and withdraw premises or conclusions, the argument will remain invalid. And I take it that the formal properties of irreflexivity and anti-monotonicity are just as interesting as reflexivity and monotonicity. So how about uniform substitution? Well, if the notion of validity that we're discussing is non-transitive, then it doesn't support uniform substitution. Of course, this depends on whether we define the notion over a purely logical language or over a richer language. If it is defined over a purely logical language, the notion does support uniform substitution, but if we define it over a richer language, it doesn't. So this is not something that we should worry too much about. But even if we worry about it, it's interesting to know that the notion of invalidity has a kind of dual property to uniform substitution, which is basically this. If you take some invalid argument and replace complex statements by atomic statements, provided that that's an instance of uniform substitution, the resulting argument will still be invalid. So, okay, we also have this kind of dual to uniform substitution, which I think is cool, at least. All right, moving on. Fourth reason, the issue about normativity. So I said that valid arguments are normative for reasoning, and then it goes to the question of whether invalid arguments are normative for reasoning in any way. And again, let me stress that this is more controversial. So there are many ways of understanding in exactly what way valid arguments are normative for reasoning. Here is one. I'm not claiming that it's the right one, but I need to work with one. So as to say something useful about invalidity, so let me focus on this one. So if an argument is valid, then one cannot rationally believe or accept the premises while disbelieving the conclusions. Now, if one understands validity in terms of coherence, then invalidity here is understood. Sorry, if one understands validity in terms of incoherence, then validity here should be understood in terms of coherence. So when I say that there's a certain invalid argument from gamma to delta, then I'm expressing the idea that it is coherent to accept gamma while rejecting delta. So more or less in the same way as validities establish certain kinds of prohibitions, invalidities establish certain kinds of permissions. So the invalidity of a certain inference should be understood as establishing a license or a permission to the effect that an agent can rationally accept gamma while rejecting delta. Now, one worry here might be that the sort of prohibitions that validity gives rise to are very different from the sort of permissions that invalidities give rise to. So, if you consider an argument from, say, the conjunction A and B to B, you think that that's valid, then you'll say that it is, in some sense, not rational for an agent, or prohibited for an agent to accept A and B while rejecting B, and that that's so not because of what A and B se, but because of the meaning of conjunction. So the prohibition has nothing to do with the content of the statements involved, but has to do with the logical form of the premise and the conclusion. But in the case of invalidities, the permission might not work in the same way. For instance, if you have an invalid argument with premise A and conclusion A and B, whether it is permissible to accept A while rejecting A and B might depend on the contents of A and B. So there's this asymmetry that one might point to there. But again, bear in mind that the notion of validity is material. So there will be some cases where whether it is prohibited or incoherent to accept the premises and reject the conclusion will be a matter of what the premises and conclusions say. So again, the disparity or the sort of asymmetry that might be posed between validities and invalidities is not as strong as one might think. Because in both cases, whether it is validity or invalidity, the property might be grounded on the contents of the statements involved, and not only in the meaning of the logical vocabulary. Okay. Right. So, okay. I've given you these 4 reasons that one might have for focusing on validity, and I've argued that if one understands validity in terms of incoherence, then these reasons lose much of their force. But one could say, well, and actually I've taken this from a referee report. Let's grant that validity and invalidity are on equal footing, but why should this claim be so interesting? Moreover, even conceding that they are on equal footing, couldn't our treatment of validity and invalidities still remain validity based on, say, purely pragmatic grounds? And I guess this complaint is fair, and let me just make a few observations as to why it might be interesting in some circumstances to focus on both validities and invalidities in a primitive way. So first, in this context, I think that we should not assume that coherence and incoherence behave classically. Okay? Because of the nature of the notion of incoherence and of the notion of coherence, it might turn out that coherence and incoherence are not mutually exclusive or jointly exhaustive. That is, it might be the case that there are some sets of attitudes which are neither coherent nor incoherent. And so we would have some kind of coherence gap. Or dually, we might have a coherence glut. Of course, the sort of situations where we might encounter this, the gaps or gluts are very rare and infrequent, but still, we should consider them. I'm thinking here specifically of kind of paradoxes involving coherence and incoherence that might force one to contemplate the possibility of coherence gaps or coherence gluts. But, okay, I'm not going to get into any details about these paradoxes. All I want to say here is that we should not take for granted that these notions behave classically, and if they don't, then there's reason to give a direct treatment of each and not define one in terms of the other. The second thing that I want to say is that one might be interested in offering what I'll call a self-sufficient theory of validity. That is a theory that talks about the validity of its own arguments. This is what we do in English. So in English, we talk about the validity of arguments in English. Okay? There's no need to postulate this distinction between an object language and a meta language, which is richer and from which we discuss the validity of the arguments of the object language. It would be great if we could do all that in the same object language. And if one wants to do that, then for reasons that I won't fully explain, it might be attractive to have a theory that treats invalidities directly. And third, and this is kind of sketchy, but I think that if validity and invalidity are on a par, then arguably it should be important for the inferentialist to articulate a theory of the inferential transitions involving invalidities. Okay, so the idea here is that to give a full theory of the meaning of certain expressions, one needs not only to explain the inferential transitions between valid arguments containing those expressions, but also inferential transitions between invalid arguments containing those expressions. Of course, I'm thinking of a secret calculus. That's why I'm talking about transitions between validities and invalidities and invalidities. All right, so okay. None of these observations should be conclusive in any way, but okay, I think it's interesting to explore where this leads us. And so what I'm going to do in the second part of the talk is to offer some kind of hybrid sequent calculus. That is, a calculus that deals not only with sequence, which represents validities, but also with anti-sequence, which represent invalidities. Okay, so we have initial sequence and also initial anti-sequence, or axioms and anti-axioms. So the axioms are, well, instances of identity. So we have this for every atomic statement, P implies P. Okay? And as for the negative part, that is the anti-axioms, we have that we have something like this. So that this holds provided all the things on the left-hand side are different from all the things on the right-hand side. Okay? By the way, because of the way in which we are understanding validity, it might be attractive to consider axioms different from those. That is, it would be desirable to have other sorts of axioms. So for instance, if you want to model, you also want to say that the inference from I am in Amsterdam to I am in Europe is valid, and not valid because of some premise that is implicit, but valid, then that should be counted as an axiom because those are atomic statements. And so it would be better to have a more general theory. But to simplify things, I'm going to focus on this toy theory, this simplified version of what would be the real theory. There's no problem with doing that. We could simply set up some, this is one way of doing it. So one sets up certain language that only contains atomic statements, and we take for granted that some of those atomic statements implies some of the other atomic statements. And then on top of that, we built a theory for the logical connectives, and a theory that has the typical structural rules. Then we have to be careful not to have every anti-axiom of this form if one does that. But okay, so I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to focus on the simplified version, where the only axioms are things that have that form, which are instances of identity. All right. How about structural rules? Well, on the one hand, we have the rule of weakening or dilution, which basically tells us that if gamma implies delta, then add whatever you want to gamma, add whatever you want to delta, the argument remains valid. Again, this should all be justified in terms of the reading of with the reading in terms of incoherence. And dually, we have a rule of anti-weakening, which is sort of obvious as well. So if it is coherent to accept all the things in gamma prime while rejecting all the things in delta prime, then if I withdraw some of the acceptances or rejections, then I'm still coherent. Right? Again, in both cases, one of the inclusions should be strict so as to avoid redundancy. What about other structural rules? As I said, I'm kind of assuming that we don't have transitivity, so that's not there. And I'm also assuming that the gammas and the deltas and so on are sets. So in this framework, contraction, exchange, and other structural rules are observed. So we don't need to worry about that. Okay, let's move on to the logical connectives and their rules. So the positive rules are the usual ones. And in the case of negation, at least, it's very easy to obtain negative rules. It's rules that allow us to pass from invalidities to invalidities. So in the rule on the top right corner, similarly for the other rule. Conjunction is a bit less straightforward, but still straightforward. So the positive rules are as usual. Now the left negative rule sort of mimics the positive left rule. And for the right rules, we have two versions. So if the one in the middle, for example, says that if it is coherent to reject phi, then it is coherent to reject its conjunction with whatever else. And here, the trick to get negative rules out of positive rules is very simple. You take the inverses of the rules, and then you contrapose them. Okay? So it's fairly obvious how one can obtain a calculus for invalidities, at least for the propositional part. And I'm not claiming any originality here. This has already been done in many places. Okay, so up until now, the calculus is purely logical, and it's only hybrid because it contains two kinds of objects. So it is a bit boring because the objects never interact. By the way, I mean, this is also fairly obvious, but the positive part of the calculus gives us a complete axiomatization for classical propositional logic, and the negative side of the calculus gives a complete axiomatization for the invalidities of the classical propositional logic. But okay, now we want the sequence and anti-sequence to interact in some way. Sorry. Now, we don't need them to interact for the purely logical part of the language. But if one of our theoretical goals is to construct a theory capable of talking about itself in the sense of a theory being that is able to talk about the validity of its own arguments, then we might have the need for hybrid rules. Okay, so in particular, if we want our theory, our hybrid theory, to prove object-language claims asserting that a certain argument is invalid, or dually object-language claims denying that some argument is valid, then hybrid rules are required, or so I claim. Now, for this, we need to expand the language in two ways. So first, we add a set of individual constants that will act as names for the statements of the language. This is because I will understand validity as a predicate. And secondly, we add a validity predicate intended to express the notion of validity. Here I'm using a two-place validity predicate, but one could generalize this and use a many-place validity predicate. Okay. And as I sort of mentioned in passing, here some care is needed because this expansion could bring about self-referential paradoxes involving the notion of validity. But I'll completely ignore this issue today. In fact, I mean, for the purposes of this talk, I could just understand validity as a two-place operator, sort of like a conditional. Okay. So what rules should the validity predicate obey? So here are the rules. So let me just put this on the screen and then I'll try to explain it. So we have two positive rules and two negative rules. They're positive because the conclusion sequence is positive, and they're negative because the conclusion sequence is negative. But in some cases we have transitions from anti-sequence to sequence or from sequence to anti-sequence. All right, so in the rules, the capital phi is understood as a bunch of phi's, and the capital psi is understood as a bunch of psi's. Then the big conjunction is, well, a large conjunction, and the big V is a big disjunction. In the rule on the top left, which is the sort of rule that one uses to introduce validity on the right, the sequent arrow, what's normally done is to restrict gamma and delta so that they are composed of validity predications only. This is to avoid certain unwanted sequence, like from P it follows that the argument from Q to P is valid. If one does not have that restriction, then one is able to prove that sequence, and some people might find that undesirable. And here I don't care much about that. I mean, first, because the notion of validity at stake is, well, validity as incoherence, and it's not that clear that that should be so terrible. But if you think that it is, then just put the restriction there, and Secondly, note that the positive left validity rule is a hybrid rule, strictly speaking, in the sense that we move from an anti-sequent to a sequent, so that rule basically says that if it is coherent to accept phi while rejecting psi, then it is incoherent to accept that it is incoherent to accept phi and reject psi. That's a bit of a mouthful. But the idea is that if we have a certain thing that it is coherent, then it is incoherent to accept that that is incoherent. Okay, which sounds fairly plausible. One interesting thing is that the context there is empty, but it doesn't need to be. In fact, provided that we have weakening and anti-weakening, the rule is equivalent to one where the context is present. So we just put the context there or remove it using weakening and anti-weakening. There's no problem there. The other hybrid rule, the one on the top right corner, is a bit more complex. So here the obvious thing to do would be to dualize the rule that I just explained and say, well, if we have a valid argument from phi to psi, then just put the validity claim on the left of the anti-sequent, and that will give you what you want. But interestingly, we need to add the right premise anti-sequent, because otherwise we won't be able to prove any claims of that form with gamma and delta non-empty. And this is because we don't have weakening for the anti-sequent arrow. You can never add stuff to anti-sequence. So we need to build the rule in this way. So there's an interesting asymmetry between these two hybrid rules. In one case, one needs two premises. And in the other case, one doesn't. By the way, it wouldn't work to put the gamma and delta on the left premise sequence. That's just a bad rule and will lead us in trouble. Okay, and the final rule, the one on the right negative validity rule has no restrictions and it's straightforward. If the argument from phi to psi is invalid, then it is invalid, or you can introduce the validity claim on the right on the anti-sequent. So in terms of coherence, if it is coherent, and omitting the context, if it is coherent to accept phi while rejecting psi, then it is coherent to reject that that's incoherent. Okay, that's the way to read it. Okay, so now I've read the rules to you, but are they plausible? And I think that the question of whether they're plausible is a hard one, and it will ultimately depend on the notion of coherence and incoherence involved. And I can say roughly this: if well, the more objective and idealized the notion of incoherence is, that is, the less it depends on the beliefs and disbeliefs of the agent under consideration, the more plausible the rule will sound. And dually, the more subjective and down-to-earth, less idealized the notion is, that is, the more it depends on the beliefs and disbeliefs of the agent, the less plausible the rules will sound. But in any case, I don't want to argue in favor of the plausibility of these rules. All I want to say is that having a calculus for both validities and invalidities allow us to provide a suitable framework to evaluate this sort of hybrid rules. And yeah, just a couple of more minutes and I'll finish. One interesting question here is, what should we expect from a hybrid calculus, formally speaking? And here are two things that might be considered desiderata for such a calculus. First, that for every valid argument according to your theory, the theory should prove the statement expressing that the corresponding argument is valid. Okay, so that's at least sounds reasonable. Perhaps it's too demanding, but it's reasonable if you want to have a theory of validity in the object language. And in fact, the rules of the theory have been constructed so that this holds. But secondly, and this is even more demanding, one could say that one could ask for this, that for every invalid argument according to the theory, the the theory should disprove the statement saying that the argument is valid. Okay? But again, because of the way in which we've constructed the rules, this holds. Okay? So if we have an invalid argument, there's one rule that allows us to refute the claim that the argument is valid. What about more global properties? Well, one might demand that the calculus is externally consistent, where external consistency is understood in the following way. For every argument from gamma to delta, the theory shouldn't have a derivation for both the sequent and the anti-sequent. So this is very reasonable. If you have a proof of the sequent and the anti-sequent, what you're saying is that there's a certain argument that is both valid and invalid. Okay. And provided that you're not a dialectist about validity, this shouldn't hold. Now, if we ignore all issues about self-referential paradoxes involving validity and so on, the calculus I presented is in fact externally consistent. And the proof is not very different from a couple elimination proof, which is nice. Okay. But of course, if there's external consistency, then there's also external completeness. So the idea here would be that for every argument from gamma to delta, the theory should either prove the corresponding sequent or the corresponding anti-sequent. I don't know whether the calculus is externally complete in this sense. If I had to guess, I would say that it is, but I'm not sure. All right. Okay, so let me make some closing remarks then. So I guess that a fancy way of stating that the main claim of the talk is by saying that the Russell-Ripley account of validity is bilateral in two different ways. So first, as it is usually put, it's not just assertion or acceptance that we as theorists should care about when providing a use-based theory of meaning. Denial is just as important. But on the other hand, and this is kind of the weird bilateral aspect that I've discussed today, if validity is understood as incoherence, and incoherence is thought to be some kind of conversational prohibition, then invalidity should be interpreted as a type of permission. And then, as we have seen, there are no conclusive reasons to privilege treatment of incoherence and prohibitions over one of coherence and permissions. Furthermore, if what I have suggested is on the right track, then at least in certain circumstances, it might be advantageous to provide a theory that treats both concepts independently. So I guess that's it.